Well, hey, everybody. Good morning to you. Thanks for being here today. You know, I heard about this British couple who they were getting married, and they were meeting with the chef who was going to do all the food for their reception. And they told the chef, they said, hey, we want prawns for our wedding reception. You know what a prawn is? It's like a shrimp, only bigger. You know, and this couple was planning to be married on a yacht, and they requested mountains and mountains of prawns that could be found in that area. Now, the chef was already struggling with this couple's British accent, really thick accent. He was having a tough time understanding them. And as he was looking back at them rather, quizzically, this, British couple, they said, look, we don't care how much it costs. And we don't care what you got to do to get these things. We just want mountains and mountains of prawns. And the chef was like, okay. Well, big day finally came, and all the guests arrived, and the scene down at the marina was really hopping. And, everybody greeted the bride and groom, and they boarded the boat, and the wine and the champagne began to flow. And after they left the harbor and had cruised around, out on the sea for a while, the groom he just couldn't wait. He was so excited, grabbed a few of his guys who stood in for him at the wedding there, and he took them to the food serving area in the back of the boat, and he wanted to, sneak a peek at the, white linen tablecloths and the ice sculpture and the flowers and all that. And when he went back there with his fellas, he saw these huge barrel-sized silver serving containers concealing what they had requested, mountains and mountains of prawns. And because the groom was just so fired up about it all, and to kind of show off a little bit to his guys, he said, hey, come on over here. And he flipped back the lids on these two big giant containers, and there they were, prunes. Like mountains and mountains of prunes, which, now he understood the chef's confusion. And my hunch is their wedding, it got off to a running start. You know what I mean? Yeah. I'm sure they had a very moving reception, probably. Now, I tell that story because I think it would be a prime example of what we might think of as unmet expectations. It's a prime example of a couple having sky-high hopes and then having their hopes sort of dashed. Because I don't know of any other area in life that routinely sets a higher level of expectation for people to hang their hopes on than the prospect of marriage. And I don't know if there's any area in life that can result in the depth of disappointment and heartbreak and dashed hopes as much as marriage. It's easy in a marriage to go from prawns to prunes. But marriage is one of the most important and significant commitments a human being can make. I actually think that outside of your choice to follow after God, it's the most significant and life-altering decision that you will ever form, who you link yourself to, and how that relationship functions specifically. So I want to get right to the heart and the substance of what makes a marriage work today. And it's essentially one thing. And specifically, we're going to look at what the Apostle Paul says about marriage, because he gave probably the most important teaching about Christian marriage that we find in the entire Bible. Now, we've been in a series all summer long that's been focusing on the life and the story of the Apostle Paul. I don't know, some of you have told me, you're really digging this series. You're getting a lot out of it. And some of you are wondering, when in the world is this series ever going to end, Dave? This is like the 99 bottles of beer on the wall sermon series, Dave. It's just never going to end. When will it ever end? I just want you to relax a little bit. It will end, but not today, all right? Now, I understand in a, room this size that there are people all over the place. Not everybody is married. I get that. Some of you are too young to be married. You're just in middle school or high school, that sort of thing. Some of you aren't necessarily looking to get married right now. Some of you have wanted to be married, but for whatever reason, it hadn't really happened. Or some of you I know used to be married, and for one reason or another, maybe you went through a divorce or you're widowed, and you're not married now, you're single now. But what I want us to understand today is that this teaching that Paul gives, it really is essential Christian teaching. And this is one of those preemptive passages that everyone should come to fully understand, no matter your marriage status. Okay, so here it is, the most famous and lengthiest section about marriage in the New Testament. It's found in the book of Ephesians, the 5th chapter. If you have a Bible, get to Ephesians 5. Paul here is writing to a church that he started in the city of Ephesus. And this section here, beginning in verse 21, is a series of rules or instructions about how life in a household should run. And these kind of household codes, they were not uncommon in the ancient world. They were these rules and regulations about how members of a household should function, how they should go about living with one another. And so Paul begins in verse 21 of chapter 5 by saying this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Some translations will say mutually submit one to another out of reverence for Christ. And this is like the banner phrase or the banner verse for everything that Paul's going to go ahead and talk about. So like this section here is placed under the idea of mutual submission. In other words, Paul says in the church, we're to experience an alternative kind of culture where people just wouldn't struggle for status or power. And that's exactly the kind of thing that Jesus talked about. He talked about this. He's talking to his disciples one time, 10th chapter of Mark. And he says, listen, among the world, among the Gentiles, they struggle for power and they lorded it over one another. That's not the way it's supposed to be with you. Not so with you. It really is true, Jesus says, that among God's people, the greatest is to be the servant of all. And that is a radical departure from normal society. And here in Ephesians 5, Paul is simply continuing this idea of Jesus' teaching. Again, it's a radical departure for us because, well, we divide. You know, who's on top, who's on bottom, who's got power, who doesn't have power, who gets to make the call, who doesn't get to make the call, who's in control, who's not in control. That's the kind of stuff we ask. It might help to think of it like this. I have flown first class one time in my life. It was sort of accidental. How many of you have ever flown on a plane before? How many of you have flown first class by chance? Okay, a few of you have. Well, I flew first class one time because my wife Melanie and I, when we were heading to the airport to go on our honeymoon. So this is the day after our wedding. This is in 1995, August of 1995. We head to the airport, and in those days, you had tickets, like hard copy tickets, and we put the tickets on the ticket counter, and we were headed to Bermuda for our honeymoon. And we handed the tickets to the people behind the ticket counter, and they said to us, hey, do you know that there might be a hurricane that's coming toward the island of Bermuda? Now, these were the days before weather apps, so we didn't know what the weather was like in Bermuda. I mean, we heard it was nice there. That's why we were going there for our honeymoon. And we kind of had our head down all week long, you know, with all the wedding festivities and people in and out of coming into town for our wedding. And then, of course, the wedding itself. We were just occupied the entire week leading into it. So we weren't really paying much attention to what was going on, you know, with the weather. And so they said, hey, do you still want to go to Bermuda? And we were like, yes, we want to go to Bermuda. It's our honeymoon. Yes, absolutely. And they said, well, in that case, would you like to go to first class free of charge? And we're like, sure. And then we figured out once we got on the plane why they bumped us to first class free of charge, because nobody else was on the plane, all right? Nobody was foolish enough to go to Bermuda when the possibility of a hurricane was coming. And sure enough, a hurricane did hit Bermuda while we were there. We had not even a day. We had a half a day. And the next day, the hurricane came over the island for a couple of days, just did all kinds of damage, rolled out. And then we had a day where we were free to go outside. But everything was destroyed, We're not going snorkeling, or, glass bottom boat tour or nothing like that was going to happen. So we just kind of bummed around the island and saw all the damage that had happened. And then they came back to us the day after that, and they said, hey, we want you to head back to the hotel and hunker down in the hotel again, because the Hurricane Felix, had turned and was coming back to the island for a second pass. I guess Hurricane Felix knew we didn't pay for those first class tickets or something. So I flew first class one time, and I've only been to Bermuda one time too. But you understand that it's very interesting, the language we use around this. There are two classes. There's first class, and then by default, you're in second class. Now, we don't call it second class. We call it what? Yeah, coach or business class, because nobody wants to fly second class, But we understand all about this. People in first class, they get all kinds of perks. People in first class, they get gourmet food. The rest of the people get what tastes like chicken. First class people sit in a spacious leather seat. The rest are crammed in like cattle back there, First class people are given moist towelettes to refresh themselves during the flight. Everybody else just sits back there and stews in their own sweat. And of course, the frosting on the cake is that not long after the plane takes off, the flight attendants, what they do is they pull a little curtain. You know that? Because heaven forbid anybody looks in from the riffraff class in the back into first class. Who knows what they're doing up there? They could be getting a sponge bath for all we know in first class. But you can't let them see you in first class. So they pull that curtain that separates the classes. Now, you see, here's the thing. For the Apostle Paul, that dividing curtain had come down. All the divisions had just been obliterated in the church by Jesus Christ. And he actually uses this kind of language. He talks about that earlier in the book of Ephesians, in the second chapter of Ephesians, verse 14. This is what's so radical about Christian community that I really think needs to be at the core of our relationship and our understanding of the kinds of things that separate people, racial issues and ethnic issues and gender issues. Paul says in Ephesians 2, he says, for he himself is our peace, who has made the two one. Now, Paul's mainly writing to Gentiles in Ephesus. They've been separated from Jews. There was incredible hostility between Gentile and Jews. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. That curtain's come down, you see. And how'd that happen? By abolishing in his flesh the law with its commandments and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace. And in this one body, in Jesus' one body, to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. See, one of the things that happened through Jesus on the cross, and a whole lot happened on the cross. One of them, of course, is that we receive the forgiveness of sins. But one of the other things that happened there, as Paul says, Jesus put to death the hostility that separates people, and he restores oneness, not just between us and God, but between us and each other. And this was a game changer for Paul. Paul never ceased to marvel at this. Never. In Jesus Christ, there is no more Jew or Greek, no more slave or free, no more male or female. Those curtains have come down. See, the church is to be this place of mutual submission and servanthood. So Paul starts by placing his teaching under the dominant theme of mutual submission. And I cannot stress this enough. And as far as I know, that was never done for any other set of household codes like this. And understand, Paul hadn't even touched marriage yet. He hadn't even gotten to marriage yet. And it's because we got to start here. This has to be the mindset. So don't forget this banner verse as we go along. Submit one to another out of reverence for Christ. Now, back to chapter 5 here. Paul goes on in verse 22, and he says this. Verse 22, wives, Submit to your husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit to their husbands in everything. Okay, any questions? Can we go home now? Now, this verse, maybe as much as any in our culture, man, it just rattles cages. People get all bent out of shape. A whole lot of people say, see, this is what I'm saying. Those Christians, they push down women. Well, no, I mean, that's not what's going on. People misunderstand this all the time. And I think mainly they misunderstand this because they ignore the banner verse in verse 21, right before you even get to these verses here in 22 and 24, 22 through 24. In fact, there's such a close connection between verse 21 and 22. Grammatically, the verb to submit doesn't even occur in verse 22 in the original Greek text. It occurs in verse 21, and Paul actually writes something like this. You could translate it like this: submit to one another, wives to husbands. In other words, one example of the mutual submission that's to mark the church is wives to husbands. Submit to one another, wives to husbands, as to the Lord. Does that mean that if you're a wife, you must do everything that your husband says without question, even if it violates God's law? No. The Bible is very, very clear that our ultimate allegiance is to God. But Paul's point is quite similar to what Jesus said when he says, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. Like anytime you offer authentic love and servanthood to another person, you offer it to God as unto the Lord. So what we need to do is we just need to pump the brakes before we get all bent out of shape, because, verse 22 says, wives, submit to your husbands. Don't forget the verse before and keep going. Notice what he says to husbands. I mean, how does Paul spell out what the husband's role is? What does he say to husbands? Verse 25, husbands, love your wives. How? Just like Jesus loved the church. And how did Jesus love the church? Notice this. He gave himself up for her. Paul defines husbandly love in terms of submission as well. Paul defines husbandly love as sacrificial self-giving. Jesus Christ gave up his own comfort, gave up his own convenience, gave up his own status, gave up his own desires. Like you remember, many of you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before Jesus goes to the cross and dies, Jesus prays, not my will, but yours be done, Lord. Not my will, but yours. Ultimately, Jesus gives up his life. He gave up everything, as much as a person can possibly give up. Jesus did. And Paul says, husbands, you be like that. Like instead of insisting on your own way, you practice self-sacrificial, self-giving love. Like 3 times, twice in verse 28, once in verse 33, Paul talks not about exercising authority over wives, but about loving her like you love your own body, and about giving everything up for her. Wives ought to do that for husbands. Husbands ought to do that for wives. Mutual submission. Wives, submit to your husbands. Husbands, give up everything for your wife. And why? Because we're following Jesus. Because it's the way of Jesus. Which is why, if someone is not following Jesus, if someone is not taking their cue from Jesus Christ, you should not link yourself to them through marriage. CCC, is this your idea of marriage? Mutual submission. Like, is this your idea? Maybe those of you who are dating, is this your idea of what you're headed for in marriage? Mutual submission. Is this what's being demonstrated in your relationship even now? In all kinds of ways with each other. And I'll tell you, if you're dating somebody or considering dating somebody, you ought to pay attention to this dynamic in their life. You ought to see exemplified all throughout their life at times where they, out of reverence and respect for Jesus Christ, they give of themselves freely and willingly. Do they take on the form of a servant? Or is it just all about them? In every situation, in every setting, on every night of the week, it's all about them, what they want, what they prefer, what they like. Are they a me monster? It's just all about them. Because if they're a me monster, you ought to run as far and as fast as you can away from them. You ought to drop them like a hot potato because you do not want to link yourself to a me monster. And if you're in a marriage where two people are just making it about, not about mutual submission to each other, but about mutual rights for themselves, the best way to begin to soften your heart and soul up to that and soften the marriage is to begin to take on more of the form of how God wants you to operate in your relationship, which is to simply begin to serve each other and defer to each other and to submit to each other in a million different ways throughout your days and your weeks and your months. I'll tell you a remarkable example of this. Like Paul talks about this same dynamic elsewhere. He deals with this same concept elsewhere when it comes to meeting someone's physical needs, like being sensitive to and being committed to the other person's needs. And he talks about this when it comes to physical needs in the Bible in 1 Corinthians 7 when he writes to the church at Corinth. And let me set this up so we can kind of visualize this. I want to show this to us because in Paul's day, of course, illiteracy was widespread. It wasn't like in our day, when everybody kind of has access to their own copy of the Bible. And we think of these books of the Bible like books, but they were letters. And they were written to a group of people. They were written to a congregation. And when a letter would come, it would be read out loud to the congregation. And you can imagine the anticipation as the people of the church would sit there and wait for what the Apostle Paul's word, his authoritative word, was when it was to be read to them. Like they'd be sitting there like, I wonder what he's going to say to us. I wonder what he wrote to us. I wonder how our life is going to be different by the time we're through hearing this letter. Picture that kind of anticipation, which, by the way, I wonder if you have that same sort of anticipation as you approach the reading and the understanding of God's word. Well, anyway, there's this anticipation, and they start reading the letter aloud publicly together. And then they come to chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, and Paul starts to talk about marriage, and he gets into sexual issues. And there are all these couples there listening, ready to hear. What's the authoritative word from the Apostle Paul going to be about sex in marriage? So imagine the anticipation of how people are listening, and then whoever is reading the letter for the congregation would read these words from 1 Corinthians 7:4. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. Imagine how happy the husbands were at this point. Like all the elbows are going into the ribs, right? Like the husbands are like, I am so glad we came to church today, honey. Like that Apostle Paul, that boy is sharp. I knew he was going to be special, man. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but to her husband. Remember last Tuesday when you said you had a headache? 1 Corinthians 7:4 from now on, baby. Like, can you imagine that? Now, that statement, it would not surprise anyone because in Paul's day, a woman was considered to be property of her father until she got married, and then she was the property of her husband. And so for Paul to say a woman's body doesn't belong to her alone, but to her husband, no surprise there, But then the reader would keep going. And they go on to the second half of verse 4 of Paul's letter. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. Now you imagine what happened when the second part got read, because that was unprecedented, right? All the women are like, you preach it, Paul. Now listen, what's Paul's point here? Is he saying that we each get to boss each other's bodies around? Is he saying that every time one spouse, say the husband, wants to have sex, the other spouse, say the wife, has to say yes? Got real quiet, didn't it? No. His point is that husbands and wives are intended by God to live in such a state of submitted servanthood to each other that they're willing to sacrifice their own comfort and their own preferences for the sake of the other. Mutual submission. Wives, give yourselves to your husbands. Husbands, sacrifice everything for your wives. I want to tell you about an experience I had where this was on display in a real vivid way. I'll never forget it. Several years ago, right after we had started the church here at Community Christian Church, our church is about 19 years old, and this was like a year and a half after we had launched the church. And my wife, Melanie, came home, and she said, "Hey, honey, this Friday, I want us to go on a date together. I want us to do dinner and a movie. You pick the place for dinner. I'm going to pick the place for the movie." All right? Now, I love movies. I love going to the movies, do it all the time. But I was not excited about my wife picking out the movie, all right? Because my wife basically has one genre of movie that she really loves. If you can call it a genre. I don't know if Hallmark is a genre. But that's sort of her, speed there. And so I said, I tell you what, how about you pick out the place we go to eat, and I'll pick out the movie, which was not the correct thing to say. And so I ended up picking out the place to eat, and she ended up picking out the movie, and she wanted to go see this one movie that had one showing on one Friday night over here on the theaters on the Avenue, and it was a Christian movie, okay? And listen, we Christians have done a lot of really good things down through the years, but making really good movies hasn't been at the top of the list, okay? It's gotten a little better in recent years, but then it was pretty bad, all right? And she wanted to go see this particular movie that starred Kirk Cameron as the main actor, all right? And again, I was not fired up at all about it because there was one showing on one night. I knew exactly what that meant. It's just going to be a theater full of a whole bunch of Christians. And no offense to Christians, I like Christians. I am a Christian. I'm married to a Christian, I try to help people become devoted Christians. I've spent my life trying to help that out. But listen, sometimes it can get weird, especially around Christian movies. And I thought, we're going to go sit with a bunch of Christians on a Friday night, crammed into one theater in there. Like, nothing about this movie is making me excited to go. But we went. And sure enough, as soon as we walked into the theater, you could cut the Christian humidity with a knife. And there was only one section that was available in that entire theater because it was so packed, and it was the front row of the movie theater. And so there we go, trancing down, heading down to the front row, and we're sitting like this, and the theater screen is huge, looking back and forth, and I'm just steaming. I'm not happy about this thing. Got my arms crossed. I just, not happy. And then the movie starts, okay? And if you've seen that movie, it's called Fireproof. And what it is, it's about a couple that are really, really struggling. Kirk Cameron and his wife, they're really both pretty selfish and self-absorbed by the time we come onto the scene here in Fireproof. And it doesn't look like they're going to make it at all. And fortunately, Kirk Cameron was a fireman, and one of his fellow firemen was a Christian and kind of directed him that way and instructed him. He got some really good encouragement that way, and his parents were real instrumental. And he becomes a Christian in the movie. I mean, surprise, surprise. He becomes a Christian in the movie, and he starts to understand that his role in this is to serve his wife, to give up, to mutually submit to her. And he takes on something called a love dare, which the idea behind that is every day you just do something for the other person that you would if you love them. It's an act of service to them. And he starts doing that. And it's tough at first because his wife doesn't respond to him at all. And he's a little surprised by this. But, he's determined, and he's got some good people encouraging him and in his corner. And so he keeps going day after day after day after day. And he just keeps serving her and serving her and serving her. And pretty soon he finds a great deal of joy in it, even if she's not responding to it, And it's a very, very clumsy and very cheesy movie, and it is way too long as well. But eventually, it's a movie, so, she comes around to him, and, it finishes in a nice little bow and all that sort of thing. But the point was right there. Mutual submission. Husbands, give up everything for your wife. Mutual submission. I walked out of the movie. I was fired up. I was excited. I was like, man, that movie, even though it was a little long, it's a little cheesy, all right, kind of clunky, but it nailed marriage. That was exactly marriage. And Melanie was actually, for whatever reason, was a little disappointed in the movie, But I'm glad she chose it. If there is a secret to marriage, it's this. Submit one to another out of reverence for Christ. Mutual submission. Because of the example of Jesus Christ and because of our commitment to him. We put ourselves off. We don't demand our rights. We give up our rights. We don't make it all about ourselves. We make it all about the other person. That is the secret. And the mystery of marriage is that somehow in the midst of all this mutual submission, we're mutually fulfilled. I don't know how a marriage can work without this. If one person is mutually submitting themselves to the other, but the other isn't, it won't last, or it will be incredibly unhealthy. This is the only way that I know of that Christian marriage works and works well, when two people say, I'm going to mutually submit to you because of Jesus Christ. Let's look now to our model, our example, our Lord, our Savior, Jesus Christ, who submitted himself to us, who gave of himself. He gave everything up for us on the cross, where he gave of his body. He spilled his blood so that we could be reconciled to God and reconciled to each other. We commemorate this every time we gather together through communion. We take a little bit of bread, a little bit of juice, represents Jesus' body and blood given for us on the cross. These little individually wrapped packets of communion, they're in the back if you didn't get one. Let's take a few moments right now. Let's think about this. Let's thank God for what he has done for us by serving us and sacrificing so that we could be connected to him and we could be connected to each other. Let's celebrate communion now.